The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant Michael Harrison adjusted his red tunic for the final time. 23 years of service had taught him that perfection was not just expected, but demanded. Every button gleamed, every crease was razor-sharp, and his black boots reflected the early light like mirrors. Today was different, though. Today, something in the air felt charged with possibility and danger. Michael had joined the Queen's Guard straight from his village in Yorkshire, a young man of 18 with dreams of serving his country with honor. His father had been a miner, his hands permanently stained with coal dust, but Michael wanted something different. He wanted to stand tall, to represent something greater than himself. The recruitment officer had looked him up and down that day in Leeds, noting his straight back and clear eyes. "You'll do," the officer had said simply, and Michael's life changed forever. Now, more than 2 decades later, he stood as one of the most respected members of the Guard. His colleagues knew him as a man of few words but unwavering principles. Children would point at him during the changing of the Guard ceremony, their faces filled with wonder at his stoic presence. Tourists would try to make him smile, laugh, or react in any way, but Michael remained motionless, a living statue dedicated to duty. The morning briefing had been routine. Captain Worthington, a thin man with a clipped mustache and nervous energy, had outlined the day's schedule. The Queen was away at Windsor Castle, but the palace still required full ceremonial protection. A group of foreign dignitaries would be touring the grounds later, and everything had to be absolutely perfect. "Remember, gentlemen," Captain Worthington had said, his voice carrying the authority of Sandhurst training, "we represent not just ourselves, but our sovereign and our nation. Any breach of protocol will be dealt with severely." Michael nodded along with his fellow guards. They had heard these words countless times, but they never lost their meaning. Protocol was everything. Tradition was sacred. The uniform they wore connected them to hundreds of years of history, to men who had stood guard through wars, coronations, and the rise and fall of empires. As the morning progressed, Michael took his position outside the palace gates. The familiar weight of his rifle felt comfortable in his hands. He had carried weapons in active combat during his early military service, but now the rifle served a different purpose. It was ceremonial, a symbol of protection and readiness, though every guard knew it could become very real very quickly if needed. The tourists began arriving as they always did. Families with cameras, school groups with wide-eyed children, couples on romantic holidays in London. They gathered behind the iron railings, pointing and whispering, trying to catch a glimpse of the famous guards who never moved, never spoke, never acknowledged their presence. Michael's training had prepared him for this. The first lesson every new guard learned was the art of disappearing while remaining visible. To become so still, so focused, that you transcended your physical form and became part of the palace itself. It was a meditation, a spiritual discipline that few outsiders could understand. A young girl, perhaps 6 years old, pressed her face against the railings and stared at Michael with unblinking curiosity. Her mother tried to pull her away, embarrassed by her daughter's boldness, but the girl remained fascinated. She waved at Michael, then made funny faces, then started dancing, all in an attempt to get some reaction. Michael's training held. His face remained impassive, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the crowd. But inside he smiled. Children reminded him why he served. Their innocence, their joy, their belief that the world was a place where fairy tale guards protected beautiful palaces. It was worth preserving. The sun climbed higher, and the crowd grew larger. Street performers began setting up nearby, knowing that the tourist traffic around the palace would provide good business. A man with a violin started playing classical pieces, his case open for donations. A woman painted herself in silver and posed as a living statue, competing with the real guards for attention. Around midday, a commotion began to develop near the palace entrance. Michael could see it from his peripheral vision, but maintained his position and composure. A black car with diplomatic plates had arrived, and several men in expensive suits were emerging. This was likely the beginning of the foreign delegation's visit. Captain Worthington appeared, his movements sharp and efficient as he coordinated with palace security. The captain's eyes swept across his guards, checking each one's bearing and alertness. When his gaze fell on Michael, there was a slight nod of approval. Michael was one of his most reliable men. The delegation approached, led by a tall man with silver hair and an air of authority that spoke of high office. Behind him walked several others, including a younger man with dark eyes who seemed to be taking notes on everything he observed. They were accompanied by palace officials, who provided a running commentary on the history and significance of what they were seeing. The Queen's Guard, one of the officials was explaining, represents an unbroken tradition dating back centuries. These men are selected from the finest regiments in the British Army and undergo rigorous training not just in ceremonial duties but in active protection protocols. The delegation paused near Michael's position. The silver-haired leader studied him with interest, perhaps trying to detect any sign of human frailty beneath the perfect uniform. Michael remained absolutely still, his breathing controlled, his mind focused on the eternal moment of duty that defined his existence. Impressive, the leader murmured in accented English. Such discipline must require tremendous mental strength. The younger man with the notebook stepped closer, his movement casual but somehow predatory. There was something about his manner that immediately put Michael on edge, though he couldn't have explained why. Years of service had given him an instinct for danger, and that instinct was now whispering warnings. "I wonder," the young man said, his voice carrying a tone of challenge, "what it would take to break such perfect composure." The palace official laughed nervously. "I assure you, sir, our guards are trained to maintain their positions regardless of circumstance. It's quite remarkable, really." The young man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Everything has its breaking point," he said quietly, though his words carried clearly in the still air. Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the London weather. Something was wrong here, something that went beyond normal diplomatic protocol. The way this man studied the guards, the calculating look in his eyes, the subtle questions about security procedures, it all added up to trouble. The delegation moved on, continuing their tour of the palace grounds. But the young man with the notebook lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on Michael with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. When he finally turned to follow the others, Michael caught a glimpse of something in his expression that confirmed his worst fears. This was not just a diplomatic visit. This was reconnaissance. As the afternoon wore on, Michael's unease grew. He had developed the ability to process information while maintaining his ceremonial stance, to observe and analyze without betraying any sign of alertness. What he had observed troubled him deeply. The young man had been too interested in details that no normal visitor would care about. The timing of guard changes, the positions of security cameras, the protocols for emergency situations. His questions had been carefully casual, but Michael recognized intelligence gathering when he saw it. The problem was what to do about it. Guards were not supposed to break character, ever. They were not supposed to communicate with tourists or officials unless directly addressed by authorized personnel in emergency situations. The chain of command was sacred, and any deviation from protocol could result in severe disciplinary action. But Michael also knew that his first duty was to the crown and the safety of all under royal protection. If he had identified a genuine threat, he had an obligation to act, regardless of the personal consequences. The shadows grew longer as evening approached. The crowds began to thin as tourists headed back to their hotels or searched for dinner. The street performers packed up their equipment, counting their earnings from a day of entertaining visitors to the most famous palace in the world. Michael's shift was nearly over. Soon, he would be relieved by the evening guard and would have a chance to report his concerns through proper channels. But something told him that waiting might be a mistake. The way the young man had studied everything, the questions he had asked, the obvious intelligence and planning behind his casual demeanor, it all suggested that whatever was being planned would happen soon. A new group of tourists approached, and among them, Michael spotted a familiar face. The young man from the diplomatic delegation had returned, but now he was dressed differently. Gone was the expensive suit, replaced by casual tourist clothing. He carried a camera and a guidebook, playing the part of an ordinary visitor. But Michael wasn't fooled. The man's eyes held the same calculating intelligence, and his movements had the controlled precision of someone with military or intelligence training. He was back for a reason, and that reason wasn't sightseeing. The man positioned himself directly in front of Michael's post, raising his camera as if to take a photo of the famous guard. But Michael could see that the camera was pointed not at him, but at the security arrangements behind him. This was definitely reconnaissance, and it was happening right now. Michael faced a terrible choice. He could maintain protocol, complete his shift, and report through channels, hoping that would be soon enough to prevent whatever was being planned. Or he could break decades of training and tradition to act on his instincts, knowing that doing so might end his career, but could save lives. The young man lowered his camera and looked directly into Michael's eyes. For a moment, the pretense dropped completely, and Michael saw the cold calculation of a professional operative. The man smiled slightly, as if to say that he knew Michael had figured him out, and was confident there was nothing the guard could do about it. That smile made Michael's decision for him. In 23 years of service, he had never broken character, never violated protocol, never put his own judgment above established procedures. But he had also never encountered a threat quite like this one. The crowd around them continued their normal tourist activities, completely unaware of the silent confrontation taking place. Children laughed, cameras clicked, guides recited their memorized histories. Life went on as normal, while Michael prepared to do something that would change everything. He thought of his father, the coal miner who had worked his whole life with his hands to build something better for his son. He thought of the young girl who had tried to make him smile earlier that morning, her innocent faith that the world was protected by good people who would stand against darkness. He thought of the oath he had taken so many years ago, to serve and protect regardless of personal cost. The young man with the camera was moving now, walking along the fence line, taking more photos, mapping out security positions with the casual efficiency of a professional. Other members of his team were probably doing the same thing at other locations around the palace. This was the final preparation phase before whatever they were planning. Michael made his choice. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to move. Not much, just a slight shift in his stance, a small adjustment in his grip on his rifle. But, for a guard who had stood motionless for hours, any movement at all was like shouting. The young man noticed immediately. His head turned back toward Michael, and their eyes met again. This time, the man's expression showed surprise and concern. He had expected to complete his reconnaissance without interference, and the guard's movement suggested that his cover was blown. Michael took another small step, then another. Each movement was deliberate and controlled, but unmistakably purposeful. He was abandoning his post, breaking every rule he had lived by for more than 2 decades, but he was doing it to protect something greater than any individual rule or regulation. The crowds began to notice. Tourists pointed and whispered, amazed to see one of the famous motionless guards actually moving. Cameras turned toward Michael, recording what many believed was an unprecedented breach of protocol. But Michael's focus remained on the threat he had identified. The young man with the camera was backing away now, clearly preparing to abort his mission and escape before he could be questioned or detained. But Michael wasn't going to let that happen. Not when lives might be at stake. Not when his duty demanded action rather than passive observation. What happened next would be talked about for years to come, recorded on dozens of tourist cameras, and debated in military circles around the world. Sergeant Michael Harrison, veteran of 23 years of perfect service, was about to make a decision that would define not just his own legacy, but the very meaning of duty itself. The confrontation that was building would test everything he believed about service, honor, and the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform of the Queen's Guard. And, in the end, it would prove that sometimes the greatest act of obedience is knowing when to disobey. The moment Michael took his first deliberate step away from his post, everything changed. The careful balance he had maintained for 23 years between duty and instinct shattered like glass, and there was no going back. The young man with the camera froze, his professional composure cracking as he realized his surveillance had been detected. Around them, the tourist crowd began to buzz with excitement and confusion. Phones and cameras turned toward Michael as visitors witnessed something they had never expected to see: a Queen's Guard breaking formation. An elderly American couple gasped audibly, the woman clutching her husband's arm as she pointed at the moving guard. A group of teenagers started filming, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Look, Mom, the guard is moving," a young boy shouted, tugging on his mother's sleeve. His voice carried across the courtyard, drawing even more attention to the unfolding drama. Michael ignored the growing commotion around him. His entire focus remained locked on the suspicious operative who had been conducting reconnaissance under the cover of tourism. Years of military training had taught him to prioritize threats, and this man represented the most serious threat he had encountered during his entire career as a ceremonial guard. The young man began moving more quickly now, abandoning any pretense of casual sightseeing. He stuffed his camera into a small backpack and started walking briskly toward the palace gates, clearly intent on leaving before the situation could escalate further. But Michael wasn't going to allow him to disappear into the London crowds. "Stop right there," Michael called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. The words felt strange after hours of ceremonial silence, but they came naturally, backed by years of training that went far beyond ceremonial duties. The command froze everyone in the immediate area. Tourists who had been chattering excitedly fell silent, suddenly, understanding that they were witnessing something far more serious than a guard taking an unauthorized break. The young operative stopped walking but didn't turn around, his body language tense with the coiled energy of someone preparing to run or fight. Captain Worthington appeared from seemingly nowhere, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. He had been conducting his routine inspection when reports reached him that one of his guards had abandoned his post. The captain had served in the Queen's Guard for 15 years and had never dealt with such a breach of protocol. Sergeant Harrison. Captain Worthington's voice cracked like a whip across the courtyard. Return to your position immediately. This is a direct order. Michael heard his commanding officer clearly, but he didn't move toward his post. Instead, he took another step toward the fleeing operative, his rifle held at the ready. The weight of disobedience settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, but his instinct screamed that stopping this man was more important than following orders. Sir, that individual has been conducting surveillance of palace security arrangements, Michael called back, never taking his eyes off his target. I believe he represents a clear and present danger. The young operative finally turned around, and Michael got his first clear look at the man's face. He was younger than Michael had initially estimated, probably in his early 30s, with dark eyes that held a dangerous intelligence. There was something familiar about his features, though Michael couldn't immediately place where he might have seen him before. I don't know what you're talking about, the man said in accented English, his voice carefully controlled. I'm just a tourist taking pictures of the famous guards. This man is clearly having some sort of breakdown. But, even as he spoke, Michael could see the man's hand moving slowly toward his jacket pocket. Every instinct Michael had developed through years of combat training told him that whatever was in that pocket wasn't a tourist map or wallet. The crowd around them was growing larger and more agitated. Palace security officers were pushing through the gathering tourists, their radios crackling with urgent communications. The situation was escalating rapidly, and Michael knew that he had very little time to act before it spiraled completely out of control. Captain Worthington strode forward, his face red with embarrassment and fury. In front of hundreds of tourists and multiple security cameras, one of his most trusted guards was creating an international incident. The captain's career would be on the line if this situation wasn't resolved quickly and quietly. Sergeant Harrison, I am ordering you to stand down immediately, Captain Worthington said, his voice low but carrying absolute authority. Return to your post, and we will discuss this matter privately. Michael felt the full weight of military discipline pressing down on him. Every fiber of his training demanded that he obey his commanding officer without question. The chain of command was sacred in military service, and breaking it was one of the most serious offenses a soldier could commit. But, as he looked at the suspicious operative, Michael saw the man's hand move another inch closer to his jacket pocket. Whatever was happening here, it was about to reach a critical point. Michael had to choose between blind obedience to authority and trust in his own professional judgment. Sir, with respect, I cannot comply with that order, Michael said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was doing. I have identified a credible threat, and I am acting to neutralize it. The words hung in the air like an accusation. In 23 years of service, Michael had never disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer. The consequences of his actions would be severe, but he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Captain Worthington's face went white with shock. Disobedience of a direct order was grounds for immediate dismissal from the service, court-martial, and criminal charges. The captain had known Michael for 7 years and had always considered him one of his most reliable soldiers. This behavior was completely out of character. You are making a terrible mistake, Sergeant, Captain Worthington said, his voice tight with controlled anger. That man is part of an official diplomatic delegation. You are creating an international incident based on your personal paranoia. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Was he wrong? Was his instinct betraying him at the worst possible moment? The doubt crept into his mind like poison, threatening to undermine his resolve. But then he looked again at the operative's position, the way he held himself, the cold calculation in his eyes. No, Michael's instincts had kept him alive through combat deployments and dangerous situations. He trusted them now, even if it cost him everything. Sir, I respectfully maintain that this individual poses a threat to palace security, Michael said firmly. I request that he be detained and questioned by appropriate authorities. The young operative laughed, a sound devoid of humor. This is ridiculous, he said, his accent becoming slightly more pronounced under stress. I am here on official business with full diplomatic credentials. This guard is clearly unstable. But, as he spoke, his hand completed its journey to his jacket pocket, and Michael caught a glimpse of something metallic. The partial view was enough to confirm his worst fears. The man was armed. Gun! Michael shouted, raising his rifle to a ready position. The single word cut through the crowd, noise like a blade, sending tourists screaming and scrambling for cover. The transformation was instantaneous. What had been a confusing confrontation between a guard and a tourist suddenly became a life-or-death situation. Palace security officers drew their weapons, tourists fled in panic, and the young operative's careful disguise finally fell away completely. Instead of the confused tourist he had been pretending to be, the man moved with the fluid precision of a trained killer. His hand emerged from his jacket holding a compact pistol, and his entire posture shifted into a combat stance that spoke of extensive military or intelligence training. Captain Worthington dove for cover behind a stone pillar, his anger at Michael's disobedience suddenly replaced by the urgent need to survive. Palace security officers were shouting commands and trying to establish a perimeter, but the crowd chaos made their job nearly impossible. Michael found himself in the eye of the storm, facing an armed operative who clearly had training and experience to match his own. The ceremonial rifle in Michael's hands was loaded. Palace guards carried live ammunition at all times, but he had hoped never to use it in anger during his ceremonial duties. "Put down your weapon," Michael commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced armed enemies before. "You are surrounded and have no chance of escape." The operative smiled coldly, his pistol trained on Michael's center mass. "You have made a serious error, Sergeant," he said, his accent now clearly identifiable as Eastern European. "You should have minded your own business." Around them, the chaos continued to spread. Tourists were streaming away from the palace gates, some screaming, others trying to use their phones to call for help or record the confrontation. Palace security was attempting to establish control, but the situation had deteriorated too quickly for standard procedures. Michael's training kicked in automatically. He assessed angles of fire, considered cover options, evaluated the risk to civilians still in the area. The operative was skilled, but he had made a crucial mistake by revealing his weapon in full view of security cameras and witnesses. "You're outnumbered and outgunned," Michael said, taking a small step to his left to improve his firing position. "Surrender now, and you might live to see tomorrow." The operative's eyes flicked around the courtyard, clearly calculating his options. Palace security officers were closing in from multiple directions, their weapons drawn and ready. Escape routes were being systematically blocked. But instead of surrender, Michael saw something else in the man's expression, a grim determination that suggested he had no intention of being taken alive. "Perhaps," the operative said quietly, "but I will complete my mission first." Michael realized with growing horror that this confrontation might have been the mission. The reconnaissance, the careful positioning, the willingness to reveal himself when discovered. It all suggested that the operative's true target wasn't gathering intelligence for a future attack. His target was creating chaos and fear at the very heart of British royal security. The operative began moving, not toward an escape route, but toward the palace itself. His pistol remained trained on Michael, but his objective was clearly to penetrate the palace grounds and create maximum damage to both security and public confidence. Michael had a split second to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could follow protocol, wait for backup, try to contain the situation without escalating it further. Or he could trust his training and his instincts, accept full responsibility for the consequences, and do whatever was necessary to protect the institution he had sworn to serve. The weight of 23 years of perfect service pressed against the urgent need for decisive action. Everything he had worked for, every commendation he had earned, every relationship he had built in military service, all of it would be measured against what happened in the next few seconds. Michael thought of his oath, taken so many years ago in a ceremony filled with pride and hope for the future. He thought of the young girl who had tried to make him smile that morning, her innocent trust that the men in red uniforms would always stand between her and danger. He thought of generations of guards who had faced their own moments of testing and had found the courage to do what was necessary. The operative was moving faster now, using the crowd confusion as cover while advancing toward his ultimate objective. Michael could see palace security officers trying to get clean shots, but civilian tourists were still scattered throughout the area, making engagement extremely dangerous. Michael made his choice. He stepped forward, directly into the operative's path, making himself the primary target and creating a clear field of fire for the security team. It was a tactical decision that prioritized mission success over personal survival, and it embodied everything the Queen's Guard was supposed to represent. "This ends now," Michael said, his voice carrying absolute finality. The operative's response would determine whether Michael's career-ending gamble had been worth the sacrifice. Everything balanced on a knife's edge as two trained soldiers faced each other in the heart of London, with the eyes of the world watching and the future of royal security hanging in the balance. The confrontation that followed would be analyzed by security experts for years to come. But, in that moment, it came down to a simple question. Had Sergeant Michael Harrison's unprecedented breach of protocol been an act of heroism or the paranoid delusion of a man who had finally cracked under the pressure of perfect service? The answer would be written in the next few seconds, in bullets and blood and the terrible mathematics of life and death that no amount of ceremonial training could ever fully prepare someone to face. The moment stretched like eternity as Michael and the operative faced each other across the palace courtyard. Around them, the world seemed to slow down, as if time itself was holding its breath to see how this deadly confrontation would resolve. The operative's finger tightened on his trigger, and Michael could see the calculation in the man's eyes as he prepared to fire. Then, something unexpected happened. From behind the operative, a voice called out in what sounded like Russian, sharp and commanding. The operative's eyes widened in surprise, and for just a fraction of a second, his attention wavered from Michael. That fraction of a second was all Michael needed. His military training took over completely, muscle memory from years of combat exercises guiding his movements. He dropped into a crouch, bringing his rifle to bear with practiced precision, while simultaneously shouting a warning to the remaining civilians. The operative spun around, trying to identify the source of the Russian command, and, in doing so, he revealed something that changed everything. On the back of his neck, partially hidden by his collar, Michael glimpsed a tattoo, a distinctive symbol that he recognized from intelligence briefings during his early military service. This wasn't just a random terrorist or criminal. This was a member of an organized group, possibly state-sponsored, with resources and backup that made the situation far more dangerous than Michael had initially realized. Palace security officers were converging from multiple directions now, their training evident in their coordinated movements. But Michael could see that they were treating this as an isolated incident, not understanding the broader implications of what they were facing. Multiple hostiles. Michael shouted, hoping to alert the security team to the larger threat. This is not a lone wolf. Captain Worthington, who had been taking cover behind a stone pillar, suddenly understood the magnitude of what was happening. His anger at Michael's disobedience transformed into grim appreciation for his sergeant's instincts. If Michael hadn't broken protocol, this attack might have succeeded completely. The operative raised his weapon again, but now he was facing multiple targets from different directions. His training was evident in his calm assessment of the tactical situation, but even the best soldier could only fight so many enemies at once. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to international law, Captain Worthington called out, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and position. Resistance will only make your situation worse. The operative laughed, a sound filled with bitter amusement. You think this is about me? He said, his accent thick with stress and adrenaline. You understand nothing. As he spoke, Michael caught sight of movement in his peripheral vision. Other figures were moving through the crowd, no longer bothering to maintain their tourist disguises. The reconnaissance mission had been cover for something much larger and more coordinated. Multiple contacts, Michael shouted, swinging his rifle toward the new threats. We're looking at a coordinated attack. The realization hit everyone at the same time. This wasn't a single unstable individual or even a small terrorist cell. This was a professional operation with multiple operatives, careful planning, and objectives that went far beyond creating simple chaos. Palace security began adapting their response, calling for additional backup and shifting their tactics to deal with multiple threats. But they were operating at a disadvantage, having been caught off guard by the scope and sophistication of the attack. Michael found himself at the center of a rapidly expanding tactical situation. His decision to break protocol and confront the initial operative had disrupted the attacker's timeline, but it had also accelerated their response. Now he was committed to seeing this through to whatever end awaited. One of the newly revealed operatives was moving toward the palace gates, carrying what appeared to be a small backpack. Michael's combat experience immediately identified the threat. The pack was likely filled with explosives designed to breach palace security and create an opening for the main assault. Bomber heading for the gates. Michael called out, while engaging the original operative who was still trying to reach his own objective. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly complex, with multiple threats requiring simultaneous attention. The original operative fired his first shot, the bullet whistling past Michael's head and striking the stone wall behind him. Chips of ancient masonry sprayed across the courtyard as the reality of live fire sank in for everyone present. Michael returned fire, his shot carefully aimed to wound rather than kill. Despite the extreme circumstances, he was still a British soldier serving on British soil, and he was mindful of the legal and political implications of his actions. The bullet struck the operative in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to drop his weapon. But instead of surrendering or seeking cover, the man reached into his other pocket, his movements suggesting he had additional weapons or equipment. Captain Worthington was coordinating the response to the other operatives, his voice sharp and clear over the radio chatter. Palace security was beginning to establish control, but the situation remained fluid and dangerous. Medical team to the main courtyard. Captain Worthington was saying into his radio, "We have wounded civilians and potentially hostile casualties. Lockdown protocols are in effect." The operative Michael had wounded was struggling to retrieve something from his jacket, his movements becoming more desperate as blood soaked through his clothing. Michael maintained his weapon's aim while trying to assess what the man was reaching for. "Stop moving," Michael commanded. "Keep your hands visible." But the operative ignored the order, his hand emerging from his jacket with a small device that Michael immediately recognized as a radio detonator. The man's objective wasn't to kill individual people, it was to signal the start of a larger, coordinated attack on the palace. Michael didn't hesitate. His second shot was aimed with lethal precision, striking the operative's center mass and dropping him before he could activate the detonator. The device skittered across the cobblestones, coming to rest near a group of tourists who had been too frightened to flee. "Detonator!" Michael shouted, rushing toward the device while scanning for additional threats. Everyone back from that area. Palace security officers were engaging the other operatives now, the courtyard echoing with gunfire and shouted commands. What had started as a peaceful tourist day at Buckingham Palace had become an active combat zone. Michael reached the detonator and carefully examined it without touching. His explosive ordnance training from his early military service helped him identify the device as military grade, confirming his assessment that this was a state-sponsored operation rather than a terrorist attack by amateurs. EOD team needed immediately. He called into his radio, using the frequency for palace security. "We have military-grade explosive devices that require specialist handling." Captain Worthington appeared at his side, breathing heavily from the exertion and stress of coordinating the response. His face was grim as he looked down at the detonator and then at the wounded operative. "How did you know?" Captain Worthington asked quietly. "How did you spot him when everyone else, including me, missed the threat?" Michael wiped sweat from his brow, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Something was wrong about his questions, sir. Too focused on security details that a normal tourist wouldn't care about. And his movement patterns were all wrong for a civilian. Around them, palace security was securing the area and tending to wounded civilians. Several tourists had been injured in the panic, though thankfully none of the injuries appeared life-threatening. The other operatives had been neutralized or captured, their coordinated attack disrupted before it could achieve its objectives. "You saved lives today, Sergeant," Captain Worthington said, his voice heavy with the implications of what had just occurred. "But you also disobeyed direct orders and violated every protocol we have." Michael nodded, understanding the complexity of his situation. He had prevented a serious attack on one of the most important symbols of British government and tradition, but he had done so by breaking the fundamental rules of military discipline. "I understand, sir," Michael replied. "I accept full responsibility for my actions." Emergency medical teams were arriving now, their sirens wailing across London as they rushed to treat casualties and secure the scene. Police cordons were being established, and Michael could see news helicopters already circling overhead. The story would be international news within hours. A Queen's Guard breaking protocol to stop a terrorist attack would capture headlines around the world, but it would also raise serious questions about security procedures and military discipline. Detective Chief Inspector Sarah Collins arrived with the Metropolitan Police, her team immediately taking control of the crime scene and beginning their investigation. She was a veteran of counterterrorism operations, and her first priority was understanding the scope and nature of the attack. Sergeant Harrison, DCI Collins said as she approached, "I need a complete debriefing on everything you observed, starting from the beginning." Michael spent the next 2 hours providing detailed statements about everything he had witnessed and done. His account was recorded, photographed, and cross-referenced with security camera footage and witness statements from dozens of tourists. As the investigation progressed, the true scope of the operation began to emerge. The attackers had been part of a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to test palace security and potentially conduct a high-profile attack during a period of diplomatic sensitivity. The detonator Michael had prevented from being activated would have triggered explosive devices planted at multiple locations around the palace grounds. The attack would have caused massive casualties and dealt a devastating blow to British prestige and security confidence. "You disrupted a major intelligence operation," DCI Collins told Michael as they concluded his statement. "Your actions almost certainly prevented a significant loss of life and a major international incident." But even as investigators praised his instincts and actions, Michael knew that his military career was effectively over. Military discipline required absolute obedience to orders, and his public disobedience of Captain Worthington could not be overlooked, regardless of the outcome. Captain Worthington confirmed this reality in a private conversation later that evening. "You did the right thing, Michael," he said, using his sergeant's first name for the first time in 7 years. "But the system can't allow what you did to go unpunished. The chain of command has to mean something." Michael accepted this with the same stoic dignity he had shown throughout his career. He had made his choice in full understanding of the consequences, and he would face whatever followed with honor. The media attention was intense and immediate. By evening, Michael's photograph was on the front page of every major newspaper in Britain, with headlines like "Hero Guard Breaks Protocol to Stop Terror Attack" and "The Sergeant Who Saved the Palace." Public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive, with thousands of people calling for Michael to be honored rather than disciplined. But military justice operated according to different principles than public opinion, and Michael knew that popular support could not override the requirements of military law. As he sat in his quarters that evening, still wearing the red tunic that had become famous around the world in a matter of hours, Michael reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He had joined the Queen's Guard to serve with honor and distinction, never imagining that his greatest moment of service would also mark the end of his military career. Tomorrow would bring investigations, hearings, and decisions about his future. But tonight, he could rest in the knowledge that when the moment of testing had come, he had chosen duty over comfort, service over safety, and the protection of others over his own career. The price of that choice was yet to be determined, but Michael knew he would pay it willingly. Some things were worth more than personal security, and the safety of those under his protection was one of them. The morning after the attack dawned gray and cold over London, matching Michael's mood as he prepared for what would likely be his final day as a serving member of the Queen's Guard. The events of the previous day felt surreal, like a vivid dream that had somehow become reality. But the ache in his muscles from the confrontation and the persistent ringing in his ears from the gunfire served as constant reminders that everything had indeed happened. Michael dressed in his civilian clothes for the first time in months, the simple shirt and trousers feeling strange after so many years of military uniforms. He had been ordered to report to military headquarters for a formal inquiry, and wearing his ceremonial uniform would have been inappropriate given the circumstances. The media attention had intensified overnight. News vans lined the street outside his small flat near the palace, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers. Reporters called out questions as he emerged, their voices blending into an incomprehensible cacophony of professional curiosity and public fascination. "Sergeant Harrison, how does it feel to be called a hero? Did you know you were risking your career when you broke ranks? What would you say to those calling for you to be court-martialed?" Michael pushed through the crowd without responding, his training in maintaining composure serving him well even in civilian clothes. He had been advised by his lawyer not to speak to the media until the military investigation was complete, but, more than that, he simply didn't know what to say. Was he a hero? A rule breaker? A soldier who had done his duty, or one who had violated the fundamental principles of military service? The answer seemed to depend on perspective, and Michael found himself genuinely uncertain about which view was correct. The taxi ride to military headquarters took him through the heart of London, past the very palace where yesterday's events had unfolded. He could see that security had been visibly increased, with additional guards posted and new barriers erected around the perimeter. The tourist crowds were smaller than usual, many visitors apparently deciding that sightseeing could wait until tension subsided. At headquarters, Michael was escorted through corridors he had walked many times before, but now everything felt different. Officers who had previously greeted him with casual familiarity now looked at him with mixtures of admiration, confusion, and concern. Word of his actions had spread throughout the military community, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about what he had done. General Sir Anthony Richardson, commanding officer of the Household Division, was waiting in his office with the expression that revealed nothing about his intentions. General Richardson was a legend in military circles, a man who had served with distinction in multiple conflicts, and who commanded absolute respect from every soldier under his command. "Sit down, Sergeant Harrison," General Richardson said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him famous throughout the British Army. Michael sat at attention, his military bearing automatic even though he was wearing civilian clothes. The office was lined with photographs of the general's distinguished career, awards, and commendations that spoke of a lifetime dedicated to military service and excellence. "Yesterday was quite a day," General Richardson began, pouring tea for both of them with the casual efficiency that marked many British officers. "I've read all the reports, watched the security footage, and spoken with everyone involved. I have a very clear picture of what happened." Michael accepted the tea but didn't drink, waiting for the general to continue. He had no idea what verdict awaited him, but he was prepared to accept whatever judgment came. "You disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer in front of hundreds of witnesses and international media," General Richardson continued. "By any standard of military discipline, that action demands severe consequences." Michael nodded, understanding that this was the beginning of his formal discipline. "Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions." "However," the general said, raising his hand to forestall Michael's response, "you also identified and neutralized a serious threat to national security that everyone else, including myself, had missed completely. Your actions prevented what could have been a devastating attack on one of our most important national symbols." The general stood and walked to his window, looking out over the London skyline. "Do you know what keeps me awake at night, Sergeant? It's the possibility that someone under my command will face a situation where all the rules and regulations in the world can't provide the right answer, where following orders means allowing something terrible to happen, and breaking orders means risking everything they've worked for." Michael remained silent, sensing that the general was working through thoughts that went far beyond a simple disciplinary hearing. "You faced exactly that situation yesterday," General Richardson continued, "and you made a choice that saved lives, even though it meant destroying your own career. That's not just courage, Sergeant. That's moral leadership of the highest order." The words hung in the air between them, and Michael found himself struggling to process what he was hearing. He had expected punishment, disgrace, possibly even criminal charges. This sounded almost like praise. That said, General Richardson turned back to face him. The military cannot function without discipline and chain of command. If every soldier decided to follow their own judgment instead of orders, we would have chaos instead of an army. Michael braced himself for the inevitable conclusion. His actions might have been morally justified, but they were still militarily unacceptable. "Which brings me to a rather unusual proposition," the general said, settling back into his chair. "Yesterday's events have created a unique situation that requires a unique solution." Michael looked up in surprise, not understanding where this conversation was heading. "The palace has requested that you be assigned as a special security advisor, reporting directly to the Royal Protection Unit. Your demonstrated ability to spot threats that others miss has caught their attention, and they want that expertise applied to improving overall security protocols." The offer was so unexpected that Michael needed a moment to process it. Instead of discharge and disgrace, he was being offered what amounted to a promotion to one of the most prestigious positions in royal security. "However," General Richardson continued, Accepting this position would require you to formally acknowledge that your actions yesterday constituted a breach of military discipline, and to agree to additional training and decision-making protocols for complex situations. Michael understood the elegant compromise being offered. He would face no punishment, but he would have to admit that his actions, while ultimately beneficial, had still violated proper procedures. It was a way of preserving military discipline while recognizing the positive outcome of his choices. "I would be honored to accept, sir," Michael said without hesitation. "And I do acknowledge that I acted outside proper channels, regardless of the outcome." General Richardson smiled for the first time during their conversation. "Good. There's one more thing, though. Her Majesty has requested to meet with you personally before you take up your new position." Michael felt his breath catch. A personal audience with the Queen was an honor that most soldiers could only dream of, and it spoke to the significance of what had transpired the previous day. "When, sir?" he asked. "This afternoon." "And Sergeant?" General Richardson's expression grew serious again. "You'll be wearing your dress uniform. Whatever else happened yesterday, you're still a soldier in the Queen's service." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of administrative procedures and briefings on his new role. Michael found himself overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of his circumstances, from potential disgrace to royal recognition in the space of a few hours. Colonel James Peterson, head of Royal Protection, conducted the briefing on Michael's new responsibilities. Colonel Peterson was a career intelligence officer with extensive experience in threat assessment and security protocol development. "Your job will be to think like the enemy," Colonel Peterson explained, "to spot the things that our regular procedures might miss." Yesterday proved that conventional security thinking isn't always enough against sophisticated adversaries. Michael learned that the investigation into the attack had revealed its true scope. The operatives had been part of a larger network with connections to hostile foreign intelligence services. Their objective had been to embarrass British security capabilities while gathering intelligence for future operations. "Your intervention didn't just stop an attack," Colonel Peterson continued. "It exposed an entire intelligence operation that we can now roll up. The damage to their capabilities will take them years to repair." As afternoon approached, Michael donned his dress uniform for what felt like a ceremony of rebirth rather than endings. The scarlet tunic and black bearskin hat that had been symbols of his service for over 2 decades now represented something new: recognition for courage under the most extreme circumstances. The private audience with Her Majesty took place in a small sitting room at Buckingham Palace, far from the public areas where tourists gathered. Michael had rehearsed the proper protocols countless times during his service, but actually standing before his sovereign was an experience that transcended all preparation. "Sergeant Harrison," the Queen said in her distinctive voice, "yesterday you faced a choice between following orders and protecting lives. You chose to protect lives, even knowing the personal cost. That decision reflects the finest traditions of British military service." Michael stood at attention, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I was simply doing my duty as I understood it." "Indeed you were," the Queen replied. "And that understanding of duty to something larger than yourself, larger even than military regulations, is exactly why you have been chosen for this new role." The Queen moved to her desk and picked up a small leather case. "It is my pleasure to present you with the Royal Victorian Medal in recognition of distinguished service to the Crown." As she pinned the medal to his uniform, Michael felt the weight of history and responsibility settling on his shoulders once again. But this time, it felt different. Instead of the burden of perfect conformity, it was the weight of trusted judgment and moral leadership. "Your new position will present challenges that no manual or regulation can fully prepare you for," the Queen continued. "You will need to continue making difficult decisions based on your best judgment and moral compass. I have complete confidence that you will do so with honor." The audience concluded with traditional formalities, but as Michael prepared to leave, the Queen added one final, personal comment. "Yesterday, you showed that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is knowing when to disobey. Never forget that lesson, Sergeant. It may serve you well again." As Michael left the palace that afternoon, he realized that his career had not ended the previous day, it had been transformed. The rigid structure of ceremonial duty had given way to something more complex and ultimately more meaningful: the responsibility to think, to judge, and to act according to conscience as well as training. The media was still waiting outside, their cameras capturing his emergence in full dress uniform with his new medal prominently displayed. But Michael no longer felt overwhelmed by their attention. He had faced a test of character under the most extreme circumstances and had emerged not just vindicated, but honored. The questions they called out now seemed less invasive and more respectful. How do you feel about your new assignment, Sergeant? What would you say to other soldiers facing difficult decisions? Do you think you'll miss ceremonial duties? Michael paused before his waiting car and spoke publicly for the first time since the incident. I would say that every soldier, every person really, may face moments where they have to choose between following rules and doing what they know is right. Those moments are never easy, and the consequences are never predictable. But if you're guided by genuine concern for others and willingness to accept responsibility for your actions, you can face whatever comes with honor. As his car pulled away from the palace, Michael reflected on the extraordinary journey his life had taken in just over 24 hours. From routine ceremonial duty to life and death confrontation to royal recognition. It was the kind of dramatic transformation that rarely happened outside of fiction. But, perhaps most importantly, he had learned something fundamental about himself and about the nature of true service. Sometimes the greatest loyalty required the courage to disobey, and sometimes the highest honor came not from following orders, but from following conscience. 6 months after that life-changing day at Buckingham Palace, Michael Harrison stood in a very different uniform, looking out over a training ground where the next generation of royal protection officers was learning lessons that had been written in his experience. The events that had transformed him from a ceremonial guard to one of Britain's most trusted security advisors had rippled outward, changing not just his own life, but the entire approach to palace security. The morning briefing room at the Royal Protection Command training facility buzzed with quiet intensity as Michael prepared to address a class of new recruits. These men and women came from various military and police backgrounds, but they all shared the same goal: protecting the most important figures in British society from increasingly sophisticated threats. Michael's new role had evolved beyond what anyone had initially envisioned. His unique experience, having successfully identified and neutralized a threat that had fooled every other security professional present, had made him invaluable as both an operational advisor and a trainer of others. The Harrison protocols, as they had become known throughout the security community, were now standard training for protection officers worldwide. "Good morning," Michael began, his voice carrying the quiet authority he had developed over decades of military service. "Today we're going to discuss something that every protection officer hopes never to face, but must be prepared for: the moment when your training, your protocols, and your chain of command all conflict with what your instincts tell you is necessary to prevent catastrophe." The assembled recruits listened intently, most of them aware that they were learning from the man whose split-second decision had prevented an international incident and potentially saved dozens of lives. 6 months ago, I was standing guard duty outside Buckingham Palace, following protocols I had followed perfectly for 23 years, Michael continued. Everything in my training told me to remain at my post, ignore distractions, and follow orders without question. But everything in my experience told me that something was terribly wrong. He moved to a large screen showing security camera footage from that day, the images that had been analyzed frame by intelligence agencies around the world. "Let me show you what I saw, and, more importantly, what I felt that made me risk everything I had worked for to pursue a suspicion." The footage rolled, showing Michael in his ceremonial position as the suspicious operative conducted his reconnaissance. To most viewers, the man appeared to be nothing more than a curious tourist, but Michael had learned to identify the subtle signs that had triggered his alarm. "Notice his movement patterns," Michael pointed out. "Real tourists move randomly, stopping to look at whatever catches their interest. This man's movements are systematic, methodical. He's gathering specific information, not satisfying casual curiosity." The recruits took notes as Michael walked them through the behavioral indicators that had first made him suspicious. It was a masterclass in threat assessment, delivered by someone who had learned these lessons under the most extreme circumstances possible. "The critical moment came when I had to choose between following orders and acting on my assessment," Michael said, pausing the footage at the moment when Captain Worthington had ordered him back to his post. Everything in military training emphasizes obedience to authority. But protection work sometimes requires us to make independent judgments under pressure. One of the recruits raised her hand. "Sir, how do you know when your instincts are right, and when they're just paranoia or stress?" It was a question that went to the heart of modern security work, and Michael had thought about it extensively during his transition to his new role. That's the hardest part, he acknowledged. I've spent months analyzing my decision-making process from that day, working with psychologists and threat assessment experts to understand what made the difference between a valid threat identification and a false alarm. He moved to another screen showing statistical analysis of his career record. Over 23 years of ceremonial duty, I had identified and reported 12 potential security concerns. 10 of those proved to be legitimate threats requiring intervention. My false positive rate was less than 20%, which suggests that my threat assessment instincts were well calibrated. The analysis had been part of his transition to his new role, and it had revealed something that even Michael hadn't fully understood about himself. His years of silent observation had made him exceptionally skilled at reading human behavior and identifying anomalies in crowd dynamics. But statistics can't make the decision for you in the moment, Michael continued. In the end, you have to trust your training, your experience, and your commitment to the mission. And sometimes, that means accepting consequences that could include the end of your career. Another recruit spoke up. Sir, would you make the same decision again, knowing what you know now about the costs? Michael smiled at the question, remembering the doubts that had plagued him in the hours after the incident. Without hesitation, he replied. The lives that would have been lost, the damage to our national security, the confidence that would have been shattered, none of that would have been worth preserving my perfect service record. The training session continued for another hour, covering tactical procedures, communication protocols, and decision-making frameworks. But the underlying message was clear. Sometimes the greatest service required the courage to break the rules. After the recruits were dismissed, Michael walked to his office overlooking the Thames. The view reminded him daily of the broader responsibility he now carried, not just protecting individuals, but helping to maintain the stability and confidence that allowed millions of people to go about their daily lives without fear. His assistant knocked on the door, bringing the day's intelligence briefings and operational reports. The attacks 6 months ago had been part of a broader campaign of intelligence gathering and potential terrorist operations, and Michael's new role kept him informed of ongoing threats and countermeasures. Sir, there's been a development in the investigation of the palace attack, his assistant reported. Intelligence services have identified the full extent of the network, and several additional arrests have been made in 3 countries. Michael reviewed the classified briefing, seeing how his moment of intuition had unraveled an international operation that had taken years to develop. The ripple effects of his decision continued to spread through intelligence networks, disrupting planned operations and forcing hostile groups to rebuild their capabilities. But, perhaps more importantly, his actions had led to fundamental changes in how security threats were assessed and responded to. The rigid protocols that had once governed protection work had been modified to allow for greater individual judgment and initiative, though within carefully defined parameters. His phone rang, interrupting his review of the intelligence reports. The caller ID showed it was his father, now in his 70s but still living in the Yorkshire village where Michael had grown up. Hello, Dad, Michael answered, automatically switching to the accent and tone of his childhood. Son, I just wanted to tell you how proud I am. His father's voice carried across the miles, thick with emotion. I've been following all the news about your new job, and I wanted you to know that everything you've achieved, everything you've become, it's exactly what your mother and I hoped for when you left for the army all those years ago. Michael felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. His parents had supported his military career without question, even when it meant long deployments and missed family gatherings. They had never asked for recognition or reward, only that their son serve with honor. Thank you, Dad. That means more to me than any medal or promotion. Your mother would have been so proud, his father continued, referring to Michael's mother who had passed away 2 years earlier. She always said you had good instincts about people, even when you were small. She would have said that everything that happened was just you being yourself. After the call ended, Michael sat quietly in his office, thinking about the long journey that had brought him to this point. From a Yorkshire mining village to the corridors of royal protection, from perfect obedience to moral leadership, it had been a path he could never have imagined when he first put on a military uniform. The late afternoon brought a visit from Colonel Peterson, who had become both Michael's supervisor and his closest colleague in the complex world of high-level security work. How are the new recruits coming along? Colonel Peterson asked, settling into one of the chairs facing Michael's desk. They're good people, Michael replied. Smart, dedicated, willing to learn. But they're all struggling with the same question I faced that day. How do you balance obedience with independent judgment? Colonel Peterson nodded thoughtfully. It's the central paradox of protection work in the modern era. We need people who can follow orders and protocols, but we also need them to think creatively about evolving threats. The conversation turned to operational matters, ongoing threats, and the continuous process of refining security procedures based on new intelligence and changing circumstances. But underlying it all was the recognition that Michael's experience had fundamentally changed how Britain approached the protection of its most important figures. As evening approached, Michael prepared to leave his office and return to his small flat near the training facility. But first, he had one more responsibility to fulfill: a weekly call with Captain Worthington, who had become a valuable ally and friend despite their confrontational first encounter. "Michael," Captain Worthington's voice came through clearly on the secure line. "How did today's training session go?" "Well, I think the new recruits are asking all the right questions, even if they don't like all the answers." "Good. That's exactly what we need. People who think critically about their responsibilities instead of just following orders blindly." The irony of Captain Worthington saying those words was not lost on either of them. The captain's initial anger at Michael's disobedience had evolved into deep respect for the judgment and courage that had driven that decision. "Any new developments I should know about?" Michael asked. "Actually, yes. We've received intelligence suggesting that other groups may be planning similar operations, trying to exploit what they see as weaknesses in our security protocols. Your training program is becoming more important than we initially realized." Michael absorbed this information, understanding the broader implications. His actions had not only stopped one attack, but had revealed vulnerabilities that hostile groups would continue to probe and exploit. "We'll be ready," he assured Captain Worthington. "The people we're training understand that this isn't just about following procedures. It's about adapting to threats that don't follow the rulebook." After ending the call, Michael gathered his things and prepared to head home. But as he walked through the training facility, he stopped at a display case containing artifacts from the palace attack, photographs, equipment, and a replica of the medal he had received from the Queen. The display was titled, "When Duty Requires Disobedience," and it served as a daily reminder to everyone who worked at the facility that courage sometimes meant making choices that went against everything they had been taught. Michael thought about the young girl who had tried to make him smile that morning 6 months ago, her innocent faith that the people in red uniforms would protect her from harm. He thought about his father's words, his mother's memory, and the legacy he was now responsible for maintaining. The world had become more dangerous and complex than anyone could have imagined when he first joined the Queen's Guard. But it had also revealed the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to rise to extraordinary challenges when faced with moments of testing. As he walked home through the London streets, Michael reflected on the strange journey his life had taken. A moment of intuition, a choice to trust his instincts over his orders, had transformed not just his own career, but the entire approach to protecting the things that mattered most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new recruits to train, new threats to assess. But tonight, Michael Harrison could rest in the knowledge that when his moment of testing had come, he had chosen correctly. And, in doing so, he had proven that sometimes the greatest service to duty required the courage to disobey.